Last week, this is the Big Book meeting. Last week we left off on page 39. Fred is a partner of a well-known accounting firm. And what we're doing here is we are establishing, remember that the book was written, it's finished in like 1939 and published, and it was written at a time where there wasn't AA, but only in 3 or 4 places. You know, I think there was a Cleveland group, there was the Akron group, the number one, there was one in, I think there was 2 of them in New York at like Bill Wilson's house, and then that one that they had started on whatever that was, 35th Street or some crap like that, I forget. But there wasn't, you know, people in the rest of the world, like in California or Utah or Arizona or Texas, there was no AA. And they had received requests from these faraway places, but they, you know, there really was nowhere to go for AA back then. AA was a fledgling, a freshly started group. There was the Oxford groups in the Northeast, a lot of, from what I heard. I don't think the Oxford groups were out in California or Texas or anything either. As far as I know, they were like confined to that little Northeast corridor there, you know, like the New England area. But so the argument was to write a book to get AA. You know, if Alcoholics Anonymous was going to be a one alcoholic working with another program, it wasn't going to get to California and Texas and you know, Utah for another 20, 30, 40 years, depending on how long, you know, one handed off to another thing. So they wrote this book to be your sponsor. Many people don't look at it. When you read this book, you have to read it from the standpoint of the context. And ooh, it's raining, huh? This roof leaks every once in a while when it rains, too. We had a couple of good ones here last year. When you read this book, you have to read it from the context in which they wrote it. It's important. If you're trying to understand what you're reading, you need to know how it was that they wrote this to take you through the steps and to be your only contact with Alcoholics Anonymous. They wrote this, in a sense, to be your sponsor, your guide through the steps. And that can easily be seen out in the chapter, A Vision for You, where, so you don't think it's my words, we'll go to A Vision for You out in 155, 157... a little further. Here it is, 163. This is, you simply read this and you can see that this is meant to be your guide through the steps, your sponsor. Not that you shouldn't get a sponsor and you should try to figure this out on your own, but what we're trying to do here is figure out, you know, our understanding of what it is that we're reading here. And he says at the bottom of page 162 in A Vision for You, and thus we grow, and so can you. Though you be but one man with this book in your hand, we believe and hope it contains all you will need to begin sponsoring others and opening up an AA meeting in your hometown and growing AA in Butte, Montana, or in California or Texas or wherever you are. Though you be but one man with this book in your hand. So there goes the idea that sponsorship, it doesn't say though you be but 2 guys, a sponsor and a sponsor who are reading this book and going over it. It says though you be but one man. And that's the idea that you need to get in your head when you're reading this thing, because it'll make it easier for you to understand what it is we're doing here. Like in this story we're getting here, Fred is a partner of a well-known accounting firm here in 39. We're transitioning into an area from step 1 into step 2 where they're talking about the insanity of alcoholism, not the insanity of you know, plotting out and murdering your wife or whatever it is, your wife's boyfriend or whatever kind of crazy, insane stuff that goes on in this world. We are not talking about that. The 12 steps will not restore a how would you describe it? Not a criminally insane, but a clinical, you know, clinically diagnosed insane person. They don't give them 12 steps and go, here, try these 12 steps, you'll be just fine. No, they give them lots of little pills and doctors and stuff. But this is 12 steps to restore the alcoholic who thinks, I can have one drink and it won't hurt me this time, when it's been killing you for the last 15, 20 years, 10 years. And you know you can't have it. Somehow, out of nowhere, after you have proven to yourself time and time again that you cannot have one drink of alcohol without it leading to another, I lost everything again, or close to it, or whatever, you know. The idea here is that that's the sanity that God will restore to us, that he will restore. And step 10 is where he says, for by this time sanity will have returned. That's what we're getting at here, is that God will restore the sanity of do you want to drink or not, yes or no. And that's what's going to happen for the alcoholic. He's going to react sanely and normally, and we will find that this has happened automatically. We haven't given it any thought. Remember, out in step 10, those are the words that he says, that we will react sanely and normally. We will not take a drink. I tell you, we'll go out there and read that just for a minute, and then I'll read real quick, and I'll open up the floor. Don't worry, you guys are going to get about 5 minutes apiece, so don't think I'm going to sit up here and babble through the whole meeting. This is out in step 10 on like page 85, I think it is. 86. The bottom of 85. Wait a minute. Bottom of 84, top of 86. Remember, we're talking about alcoholic. We're even going to give it a title here. We're going to say alcoholic insanity and loony bin insanity, or nut house insanity. At the bottom of page 84, the promises of the 10th step. The promises of the 10th step are like one big paragraph with part of it starting here at the bottom of 84. And we have ceased fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol, for by this time sanity will have returned. Remember in step 2 he says that came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And the idea that we're trying to get here is the sanity that we speak of, and these 12 steps are going to restore to us. They're not going to restore that we're going to stop stalking our wife and plotting her new boyfriend's murder, something along those lines. What it's going to restore is how you react to the first drink. Do you want one, yes or no? As an alcoholic, the thought comes into my head and says, you know what, I think it's been 3 months, it's been a week and a half, I can have one, and here's how. I proceed to tell myself that I can do it this time, but it's been 10 years of that nightmare, and I have no mental defense against that first drink. And that's what we're trying to establish here. For by this time, sanity will have returned. What time does sanity return? When we're doing this daily inventory and applying these four spiritual solutions. I'm going to start saying 4 because I'm going to start adding confession to that, or admission, if you would. In the 12 steps, in step 5, it's admission. But we have forgiveness. First, step 5 would be like admission, and 6 and 7 would be forgiveness, 8 and 9 would be making amends, and 12 would be having faith. And by those spiritual solutions that we have, that's what we're going to be doing every day in step 10 here, with the exception of step 12. Of course, when you look at the 12 steps the way that they're written, 10, 11, and 12 are really, it's not like you're getting 6 months later you're doing step 12. You're doing 10, 11, and 12 essentially within a few days, because if you'll read Bill's story, even he says, while I lay in the hospital bed, the thought came to me that there were thousands of alcoholics out there who could use this message. But anyway, we will seldom be interested in liquor. If tempted, we recoil as if from a hot flame. We react sanely and normally, and we will find that this has happened automatically. We'll see that our new attitude toward liquor, why has it happened automatically? Because the fear that drove us to it will no longer be there. But anyway, back to the idea here. When we're reading these stories of Jim is the first, what's he say when we were reading last week was our first example we shall call Jim. This is the second example. Fred is a partner of a well-known, oh, wait a minute. Is that second or third? Did we get the, That's the after. I think that's after this. And so too is the jaywalker. And jaywalker and a man of 30. Anyway, so Fred is a partner in a well-known accounting firm. His income is good. He has a fine home, is happily married, and the father of promising children of college age. He has so attractive a personality that he makes friends with everyone. If ever there was a successful businessman, it is Fred. To all appearances, he is stable, a well-balanced individual. Yet he is alcoholic. We first saw Fred about a year ago in a hospital where he had gone to recover from a bad case of jitters. It was his first experience of this kind, and he was much ashamed of it. Far from admitting he was an alcoholic, he told himself he came to the hospital to rest his nerves. The doctor intimated strongly that he might be worse than he realized. For a few days he was depressed about his condition. He made up his mind to quit drinking altogether. You know, that's one of the words that's used in the early area, the first few pages of More About Alcoholism, where he talks about we must the desire to quit altogether. And I'm always hearing people in AA say, "Oh, don't worry, you just worry about the 24 hours at a time. It's absolutely imperative, in my opinion, to come in here wanting to stop drinking forever and to never want to take a drink of alcohol as long as I live. If I came into AA and said to myself, and it's my opinion, and I believe it's backed up with this, he made up his mind to quit drinking altogether. There's a couple of places in here where on page 34, for those who are unable to drink moderately, the question is how to stop altogether, right in the middle of the page there. This is the same chapter, more about alcoholism. For those who are unable to drink moderately, the question is how to stop altogether. We are assuming, of course, that the reader desires to stop. Whether such a person can quit on a non-spiritual basis depends upon the extent upon which he has already lost the power to choose the will. But there's another place in here where he brings that up again, the altogether idea. And that's essentially saying to stop forever, for good, never take another drink as long as I live. The doctor... It never occurred to him that perhaps he could not do so. In spite of his character and standing, Fred would not believe himself an alcoholic, much less accept a spiritual remedy for his problem. We told him what we knew about alcoholism. He was interested and conceded that he had some of the symptoms, but he was a long way from admitting that he could do nothing about it himself. He was positive that this humiliating experience, plus the knowledge he had acquired, would keep him sober the rest of his life. And you know what? There's no way that you can get a sponsee that you're working through the steps to get over this lump. And this is the idea here that only alcohol can deliver to us, the idea that there's only two options here. One is to go on to the bitter end, and the other is to accept spiritual help. There is no third. This third option here that he's juggling in his mind, that he was positive that his humiliating experience plus the knowledge he had acquired would keep him sober the rest of his life. Self-knowledge would fix it. If you were a real and there are people like that who come in here, and that's one of the things I like to point out to my sponsees. I say, okay, I happen to know most of the guys I sponsor. Very few of them are people that I've never met before. And I say, you've been bouncing in and out of here for years that I've known you, and you're drinking again. And what I see when I see you come in here is you don't sponsor people. I don't see you either reading the book or going through this like, what do they say, with all the desperation that the drowning men grasp a life preserver. You don't act like this is the most important thing in your life. I hear people say things like, I would like to get my life back. I didn't come in here to dedicate my life to this AA place. I mean, this is as bad as death. And then they say something like, I need to get my life back, and I'd like to balance my life between coming to AA and doing the AA and then going out there and living my life. And that's the first thing I think is, uh-oh, he hasn't found it yet, has he? This is either the most important thing in your life. If you were a real alcoholic like me and Fred and the rest of us that are coming in here, this is the most important thing in your life. And that's going to be the difference between people who come in here and stay sober and never take another drink as long as they live. And I believe that. I'll never take another drink as long as I stay on this path. And that there's some people, you're looking at people who come in here and they don't do these things. They don't sponsor people. They don't dedicate their life to AA. It's not the most important thing in their life, and you can see it through their actions. They come strolling in late. They leave early. They talk to all the good-looking women. They half-ass most, and you're saying to yourself, yeah, look at that. He doesn't have to dedicate his life to this AA thing, so why do I have to do it? Because he can stop on a non-spiritual basis, and that part of the rules that we have in AA does not say that you must be a real alcoholic. And we have a test that we're going to put you through, otherwise you're out of here. We let people come in here who can stop on a non-spiritual basis, and that's fine, but we have to make sure that people who are real alcoholics like me know that there's a difference between somebody whose life it depends on, like myself, and somebody who can stop just by thinking that, like he says here, he was positive that his humiliating experience plus the knowledge he had acquired, and for some people this may suffice. This may very well stop them from drinking ever again. The knowledge he had acquired would keep him sober for the rest of his life. Self-knowledge would fix it. We heard no more of Fred for a while. One day we were told he was back in the hospital. This time he was quite shaky. He soon indicated he was anxious to see us. The story he told us is most instructive, for here was a chap absolutely convinced he had to stop drinking, who had no excuse for drinking, who exhibited splendid judgment and determination in all his other concerns, yet was flat on his back nevertheless. Let him tell you about it. So this is Fred telling us his story about what happened to him. Why this self-knowledge plus the humiliating experience would keep him sober, why it failed to work. I was much impressed with what you fellows said about alcoholism, and I frankly did not believe it would be possible for me to drink again. I rather appreciated your ideas about the subtle insanity that precedes the first drink. And that subtle insanity is based in fear, and all fear is based in self, and that's one of the most basic ideas of Alcoholics Anonymous. That the lack of faith in God is one of the driving factors of this subtle insanity, that somehow we think that secretly in the back of our mind we are not in control of this world and the things that are going on in my life. Somewhere in the back of my mind when I was drinking, I said to myself out front, and I thought to myself, I am in control of my life, my destiny, the things that are happening to me, and secretly in the back of my mind was a lingering fear that I had control over nothing. I could not even control my breathing when I was sleeping at night. I couldn't control my heartbeat. And only thing I could control with my heartbeat was to run, get it going faster, or to slow down and sit down and get it slowing down. That was my ability to control something so close to my life, much less when you're going through these lights on the way home, how much control do you have over whether somebody in one of these cop chases comes barreling through the red light and T-bones you at 60 miles an hour? All you can do is trust in God that you're going to make it through this light. Without, I go through 1,000 lights a month, and you go through every one of them. Faith in God that I'm not going to get T-boned by somebody running from the cops or something. And that's the idea here. The subtle insanity which precedes the first drink is a lack of that trust and faith that everything's going to be okay. But I was confident it could not happen to me after what I had learned. I reasoned I was not so far advanced as most of you fellows, and I had been usually successful in licking my other personal problems, and that I would therefore be successful where you men had failed. I felt I had every right to be self-confident, that it would be only a matter of exercising my willpower and keeping on guard. In this frame of mind, I went about my business, and for a time, all was well. I had no trouble refusing drinks and began to wonder if I had not been making too hard a work of a simpler matter. One day I went to Washington to present some accounting evidence to a government bureau. I had been out of town before during this particular dry spell, so there was nothing new about that. Physically, I felt fine. Neither did I have any pressing problems or worries. My business came off well. I was pleased and knew my partners would be too. It was the end of a perfect day, not a cloud on the horizon. I went to my hotel and leisurely dressed for dinner. And here in italics is the insanity, the subtle insanity that precedes the first drink that happened to him. This is where his relapse occurred in his life. I crossed the threshold of the dining room. The thought came to mind that it would be nice to have a couple of cocktails with dinner. That was all, nothing more. I ordered a cocktail and my meal. Then I ordered another cocktail. After dinner, I decided to take a walk. When I returned to the hotel, it struck me that a highball would be fine before going to bed. So I stepped into the bar and had one more. I remember having several more that night and plenty the next morning. I have a shadowy recollection of being in an airplane bound for New York and of finding a friendly taxicab driver at the landing field instead of my wife. The driver escorted me about for several days. I know little of where I went or what I said and did. Then came the hospital with unbearable mental and physical suffering. As soon as I regained my ability to think, I went carefully over that evening in Washington. Not only had I been off guard, I had made no fight whatever against that first drink. This time I had not thought of the consequences at all. I had commenced to drink as carelessly as though the cocktails were ginger ale. I now remembered what my alcoholic friends had told me, how they prophesied that if I had an alcoholic mind, the time and place would come. I would drink again. They had said that though I did raise a defense, it would give way before some trivial reason for having a drink. Well, just that did happen and more, for what I had learned of alcoholism did not occur to me at all. I knew from that moment that I had an alcoholic mind. I saw that the willpower and self-knowledge would not help in those strange mental blank spots. I had never been able to understand people who said that a problem had them hopelessly defeated. I knew then it was a crushing blow. So see, this guy has been delivered just like I was, that I was an alcoholic and that I have no defense against that first drink. No matter what I do, I have no defense, no effective. That's one of the key points he says there. That I have no effective mental defense against the first drink. And this defense must come from a power greater than me. I have no power over this. 2 of the members of Alcoholics Anonymous came to see me. They grinned, which I didn't like so much, and then asked me if I thought myself an alcoholic and if I were licked this time. I had to concede both propositions. They piled on me heaps of evidence to the effect that an alcoholic mentality such as I had exhibited in Washington was a hopeless condition. They cited cases out of their own experience by the dozen. Now, that's an important part right there. When I'm working with my sponsees, I didn't used to do that. I used to try to just burn it into their head that, and you know, I've recently, as I read out there in the chapter, working with others, it's absolutely important that I make a connection with, even though I may tell them, yes, I'm an alcoholic, that for me to give them details of something that happened to me. And I'll give you an example. The last night I was drinking, I stepped into the bar and found myself almost, before I even took a drink, I felt like I was in a blackout and had gone into the bar in a blackout, only I hadn't had a drink yet. And I looked around and I go, how in the hell did I end up in here? It's like remember how I used to drive home at night drunk and then run outside when I woke up to see if my car was there and go, man, I don't know how my car got here, but I guess I got here again, drinking and driving home. But that's how I would end up in the bar. I was like I was in a blackout, and autopilot took me right into the bar, only I hadn't even had a drink yet. That to me was, and then, you know, the last night that I was drinking, I swore I was not going to step off into this bad neighborhood over here and pick up some stuff to, you know, finish off my booze night. And stories like that, and that was my last night out there. Stories like that I always try to help my sponsees with. It's sort of a connection that we make with those people to help them, you know. Even though the first step can only be delivered to me or them as an individual, it gives me in the story of this, you know, that they are a real alcoholic just like me, a little more credibility when you give them some of their. They cited cases out of their own experience by the dozen. This process snuffed out the last flicker of conviction that I could do the job myself. You see that even though he has been delivered the idea that he's beaten by alcohol, these other 2 guys, 2 of the members of Alcoholics Anonymous, came to see me. They grinned, and what did they do? They cited cases out of their own experience by the dozen. This process snuffed out the last. They're helping him along here, even though you cannot give an individual step 1. You can help them understand what it is that they're experiencing, and that without the followed work of 2, 3, 4, 5, and these other steps, which I guess we can help them along, but we can't give it to them. You understand? We can give somebody step 4, but you can't make them implement the daily inventory that's outlined later on. You can't. You know, there's certain things that we can do for other people and certain things we can't. They must do for themselves. But anyway, they outlined the spiritual answer and program of action, which 100 of them had followed successfully. What did they do? Then they outlined, what are you being sarcastic there? Then they outlined the spiritual answer and program of action, which 100 of them had followed successfully. Though had been only a nominal churchman, their proposals were not intellectually hard to swallow. But the program of action, though entirely sensible, was pretty drastic. It meant I would have to throw several lifelong conceptions out the window. That was not easy. But the moment I made up my mind to go through, now this is step 3, right? This is step 3 here. The moment, and I guess you could say step 2 would be back around that, though I had been a nominal churchman, their proposals were not intellectually hard to swallow, being, you know, do you believe? You know, that's one of the things I do with all my sponsees now. When somebody says, will you take me through the steps? The first thing I say is, like Dr. Bob, I say, do you want to stop drinking? They say, yes. I go, do you believe in God? And 99.9% of them say yes. And I read in one of the other books, I can't remember where, but that's what Dr. Bob did with his guys, because he had so many people that he was working with. He wouldn't actually sit them down and explain step one. He would simply say, do you want to stop drinking? Because I have had a couple of people go, well, having a little trouble, and I'm having some trouble with the little pills or the weed or something, and if I could just kind of like taper off. I go, oh, I got you. It's very rare that somebody doesn't say, yes, I want to stop drinking. But I have had a couple of people, when I say, do you want to stop drinking, where they hesitate for a minute. And I could give you their names, too. You probably know who I'm talking about. And they've been in and out of here, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to tell you that I am surprised myself when I see somebody who I know needs to stop and says, if I could just taper off a little bit, I'd be just fine. I really don't want to stop. I just want to, But anyway. But the moment I made up my mind to go through with the process, I had the curious feeling that my alcoholic condition was relieved, as in fact it proved to be. So that's like step 3. The moment I made up my mind, made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God. Quite as important was the discovery that spiritual principles would solve all my problems. I have since been brought into a way of living infinitely more satisfying and, I hope, more useful than the life I lived before. Once again, back to the guy who comes in here, and I've heard just as recently as a few days where somebody I know who has some time says, I need to get my life back, man. I've been dead. I've been coming to too many AA meetings. I feel like this AA is the only reason I'm alive. I got to get my life back. And I heard somebody say, well, what life are you talking about? Because remember where your life went to. Just before you came in that door, you were ready to give up. My old manner of life was by no means a bad one, but I would not exchange its best moments for the worst I have now. That's probably a precursor to that, my best moments. You guys hear that thing all the time. My best moments, and I wouldn't give up my worst moments in sobriety for my best moments. That's pretty much what he's saying right there. That's where it came from, I guess. But I would not exchange its best moments for the worst I have now. I would not go back to it even if I could. Fred's story speaks for itself. We hope it strikes home to thousands like him. He felt only the first nip of the ringer. Most alcoholics have to be pretty badly mangled before they really commence to solve their problems. Many doctors and psychiatrists agree with our conclusions. One of these men, staff member of the world-renowned hospital, recently made this statement to some of us. What you say about the general hopelessness of the average alcoholic's plight is, in my opinion, and this is Dr. Silkworth, I'm guessing. So this is many doctors and psychiatrists agree with conclusions. One of these men, staff members of a world-renowned hospital, that was that hospital that Silkworth was in up there, recently made this statement to some of us. What you say about the general hopelessness of the average alcoholic's plight is, in my opinion, so you might say the doctor's opinion, correct. As to 2 of you men whose stories I have heard, there is no doubt in my mind that you were 100% hopeless, apart from divine help. Had you offered yourselves as patients at this hospital, I would not have taken you, if I had been able to avoid it. People like you are too heartbreaking. Though not a religious person, I have a profound respect for the spiritual approach. In such cases as yours, for most cases, there is virtually no other solution. Once more, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink, except in a few rare cases. Neither he nor any other human being can provide such a defense. His defense must come from a higher power. All right, so we'll do We Agnostics. Start We Agnostics next week, and We Agnostics is essentially, do you believe in God, yes or no? And it's there's an actual paragraph in there that is dedicated to atheists and agnostics. And remember, some of the things that he points out there, that roughly 50% of the original 100 were atheists and agnostics. But back to the insanity idea, I think for me one of the most important things was to realize and to try to carry that message to other AA meetings, because I sit in this room right here and I hear people say things like, my life's getting insane again. The insanity's coming back into my life. Only, you see, if you haven't picked up the first drink, then the insanity has not come back into your life, because what we're talking about is the subtle insanity that precedes the first drink. And I can understand how people say that there's something wrong, because there was a story about Marty Mann, the first woman to ever get sober, who was sober with Dr. Harry Tebow of this psych ward up there in New York, one of those hospitals there. And what she had said was that when she first got sober, she said, I felt a flash, something went over me, and I felt like I saw the moment of clarity. I saw myself as I really was in the world, and she swore that she would never take another drink, and she was done with this alcohol, and this was different. There was a spiritual thing to it, and like 2 weeks later, because there was no work involved, she never did an inventory. She never did the following, the spiritual solutions, the daily inventory to follow that up, the turning of your life over to God, the helping others through the 12 steps. None of this had taken place, and she came back a couple of weeks and said, look, I know I told you a couple of weeks ago that I would never take another drink, and I felt confident that there was something different about this. The old me is coming back. Something, I can't quite put a finger on it, and you see, that's the failed to enlarge that part where he says in the other story, but he failed to enlarge his spiritual life, and he drank again. So remember, when we're talking about insanity, we're talking about fear, and we're talking about a lack of step 12, because step 12 is how we combat fear in AA. We try to bring others to this God of their understanding, and the idea that you need to be a Zen master at it is, in my opinion, what keeps a lot of people from getting sober. Same thing. There was a time when I was sober, a couple of years, 3 years, and I said to myself, I had people ask me to sponsor them, and I'd tell them, I'm not really the sponsoring type. And I got in a jam. I didn't drink. I ended up getting a sponsor, and he ended up through no doings of mine, he ended up assigning me sponsees, because he was doing that with everybody. All the guys that he sponsored, he was so overwhelmed with people, he would say, you and you, and you and you, and I just had 5 guys at this meeting ask me to sponsor them. I don't have the time, so I will assign my sponsees to you. And that's, fortunately, I came across a guy who did that for me. Otherwise, I would have been one of those people who comes in here and says, the sponsorship thing is, that's for some people, and pushing in chairs is for others, and I think I'll stick to pushing in chairs. Thank you very much. Making coffee, cleaning the place up. But it cannot be done without. You can't do without sponsorship of others. If you are a real alcoholic, it must be done. It must be the most important thing in my life, or I go back to, just like Fred, I'll drink again. We'll open up the floor. We got about 7 minutes for each one of you, 5 minutes for each. And when we were reading more about alcoholism, we see somewhat of a transition between step 1 and step 2. The idea, that the stories that we were reading, the Jim and the man of 30 and Fred, and the idea that the jaywalker, the idea that there's an insanity that we have in our lives, and we're transitioning into this second step, because this chapter, We Agnostics, is essentially the question, do you believe in God, yes or no, is one of the early timers of AA used to approach people in that way, and Dr. Bob in particular would say, do you want to stop drinking? They'd say yes. They'd say, do you believe in God? And most people, although this thing here says about half of our original fellowship, where you could say out of 100 people, that would be 50, would say that they don't know whether or not they believe in God, or no, they do not believe in God. Half are atheists or agnostics. But most of the people I've come in contact with do say yes, they believe in some kind of power greater than themselves or whatever. And that was it. It would take you straight into the fourth step. And the third step would be whether or not, you went on with the rest of the steps. And but here in this chapter, a lot of times over the years I've heard people refer to this chapter as if this was the chapter that says you don't need God to get sober. And I mean that. They would say, oh, you don't need God. Turn to the chapter to agnostics. And they would take something out of context and say one sentence that not in the paragraph that it was in, designed to prove that you don't need God to get sober. And I know this ain't the religion thing really rubbed me the wrong way, and sometimes it still does when I'm in here, and somebody, one of the more religious people or somebody, it's always somebody who's early in recovery. I'll give you an example. One of the guys that I'm working with right now calls me up, and we've butted heads a few times on the honesty thing. And remember, in the Oxford groups, they had those tenets that they talked of, the absolutes, and one of them was absolute honesty. And when you read the literature, you see the reason that Alcoholics Anonymous broke away from the Oxford groups was because of this the depth of their, the absolute honesty, absolute love, absolute, and these are virtually unattainable. Although, you might set this as a goal for yourself, absolute honesty really is unattainable. We're even instructed to lie. Was my take on it. Was in the ninth step where it says, except when to do so would injure them or others, says that if you're going to say something that's true to somebody and it's going to hurt them, it's going to really, like a ton of bricks on the plane of, like, you tell your wife you cheated on her and it was her sister, and you destroy the relationship between her and her sister for maybe even a decade or something, But so you're almost instructed to lie to keep from hurting them. And this buddy of mine says, no, you're not instructed to lie. It's not volunteering information is not the same as lying. And I'm like, the same thing that I heard was, well, you're splitting hairs with that one. The idea that absolute honesty is, anyway, back to what I was talking about, the reason we broke away from the Oxford groups was the absolute honesty idea. And one of the things that I was saying was that the idea of honesty is, when I first got sober, I was so afraid of lying, and I thought I would drink if I lied. I said, if I lie about anything, no matter what it is, I'm done. It's over. And as you relax over the years, you got to thinking, well, this is really about turning your life over to God and doing what, and what I was getting at was that when I first got sober, and I see some of the early people come in here with the idea of religion, and they're just so overwhelmed with, the release of the obsession, that first drink, and somebody come in here and go, religion this, religion that, and they start spouting off a 5-minute spiel on their particular religion, and it just, the rest of the room's like, man, will somebody throw that guy out of here, please? But anyway, this chapter, We Agnostics, is based on an explanation that, as Bill put it in his story, you don't need someone else's concept of God to get by. All you need is the willingness to believe that there is something there, you don't know what it is, and in working the rest of the steps, it will come to you, because if you do it the way that it's outlined, you will get the results that are described in here. You will get release of that insanity that drives that first drink. Anyway, we're going to read a couple of 3 or 4 pages. We'll open up the floor for open discussion. That gives each one of you about 5 minutes to talk. So don't think you're getting out of here without saying anything. I'm going to ramble on for a little while here, and this is Chapter 4, We Agnostics. Essentially, when you read this chapter, you got to keep it in the context of that the Big Book was meant to be your sponsor. The Big Book was written on the premise that Alcoholics Anonymous was one alcoholic working with another. It was one person transmitting this to another person, but that the message might get diluted as it works its way through 30 people, and it wouldn't get to California for another 25 years, one person at a time from Akron, Ohio to California. So they reluctantly agreed to write the book, and that this book was written as your guide through the steps. And whenever you read that, you need to keep that in mind, because it'll help you understand what it is you're reading. You're reading this from the standpoint of they assume that you know nothing about the program of recovery, and they're trying to get to the basics of it. So We Agnostics, Chapter 4, in the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism. Now remember, when he says we hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. He's explaining this from the standpoint of the people who wrote this book. We, the people who wrote this book, hope that we, the people who wrote this book, have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. And the reason for pointing that out is the whole we program thing has been so distorted lately in many of the meetings that I go to, that it's based on the psychotherapy idea that people can lean upon each other and get what they need from other people. The support group. Oh, you need a support group. You need people. Yeah, you do need people, but remember, don't lose track of the God thing, because many people describe that in such a way that it takes away from it's almost people who come in here looking for an easier, softer way and hear the we program thing and the we idea and you can get numbers and together we can get sober. Then they start the easier, softer way thing to get away from the idea of you and God thing, which is much harder to do in my experience. It's a lot harder than the easier, softer way, the no human power can relieve our. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you are probably an alcoholic. So you remember the 40 questions or the 60 questions or whatever it is to find out whether you're a real alcoholic? That's the 2 questions. These are the 2 questions of Alcoholics Anonymous. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, 2 questions, you are probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Now remember, he's talking about the idea here that he's up in the top of this. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic, and the idea that you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. And this goes back to the same idea that I bring up each week, and that is not everybody in this room is a real alcoholic. And whenever I'm taking guys through the steps, and I say the same thing. When I first got sober, I would come into the room and I would say, well, look at this particular guy. He's working so hard. He's dedicating his life to AA. He's here all the time. It's like his life. How sad is that? You know, and then there's this guy who just comes strolling in every once in a while. He hits on all the women. He's driving a nice car. He's got a company maybe. He's got all this stuff, and he hardly ever does anything around here. He's just half-assing the program, and he's staying sober. But the distinction that I'm not making is that not everybody who comes in here is a real alcoholic like myself. So therefore, it almost brings about the idea of the chronic relapser who comes in here and sees the easier, softer way of the guy who's driving the Corvette and hitting on all the women and coming in late and leaving early. And then there are non-alcoholics. There are people who come in here who don't need this spiritual experience. And a lot of times I'm in meetings and I hear people, and you know what, I do the same thing. When I hear somebody say that, I go, you know, maybe, how pathetic is it that my life is to center around AA and I have to come to this place and I got to help other people. What a pathetic life that is. But here's the option. That pathetic life that I had out there, sleeping behind a dumpster and going from one beer to the next, and I would get sober and get something back in my life and then gone again. That's the only other option. There is no that third option of hanging around here once in a blue moon, driving a Corvette, hitting on the women, and scrolling. That ain't for me, because I am. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer, and that is me. I established that, and what we're trying to do here is explain this to some of the people who come in here. To one who feels he is an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. But it isn't so difficult. About half our original fellowship were of exactly that type. Half of the original fellowship were atheists or agnostics. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. And or else is a reference to that nightmare that I keep running away from when I come into that door when I'm in that relapse thing. And I did it for a couple of years. I'm not one of those guys who said, oh, I came rolling in here and never had another drink again. No, I rolled in and out of here for 2 years. In and out, back and forth. So I have some experience in that field there. Perhaps it is going to be that way with you, but cheer up. Something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. So essentially what he's saying here is don't close the book and walk away from it now that you realize that the only way out that we have is a spiritual experience, a spiritual way of life, the spiritual experience. And you know, this spiritual experience that they speak of, and the way that I read the steps and the way that I come to it was simply a matter of, like, if you look at it in step 12 where he says awakening, but I've heard and I've been told that the spiritual awakening was changed in those steps by what they called the editorial board back then, which was like 2 or 3 guys that said, hey, Bill, change this, change that. They changed a few things, and they have the original draft still somewhere on the internet or something. But the idea that I'm getting at here is that I've had sponsees ask me, what's the difference between a spiritual awakening and a spiritual experience? Well, the difference is he wrote spiritual experience up there, and the editorial board of one of those, I think it's probably one of the anti-God guys, who made him put God as we understand him, because he wrote God flat out, God, God, God. And some of these atheists and agnostics were real turned off by that, just like I am today by the guy who comes in here and tells me all about his religion, and I'm like, we need a bouncer in here for this guy, If you're not here long enough to experience that, you will be. Someday some guy's gonna go off on some religious tirade, and maybe I'll give you an example. Let's say he's one of those religious extremist Muslim guys, and he's going to come in here and talk about the infidels and how he's got 16 virgins waiting in heaven for him if he'd kill us all or some shit. And we're just like, somebody get that guy out of here. That's the same thing to me that I hear when I hear somebody else with any religion that they bring in here. But cheer up, something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. If a mere code of morals or better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, and this is one of the things I see a lot of people make a mistake of, is, in my opinion, this may be, that some people come in here and think, like I was telling you, that little story about one of the guys I'm working with this absolute honesty thing that he's going on. I'll give you an example. It was a job application that he was making a reference to, where it says, "Are you a convicted felon? Yes or no?" And I said, "Shit, anybody would have a brain's going to write no on there, because if you write yes, you may as well just get up and walk out." I have no idea who's calling me, but they can talk to the machine. And I said, I'd lie in a heartbeat if I thought, if you're not applying for a $150,000 a year job, you can pretty much be assured they're not going to be calling and going, "Is this guy a convicted?" The job applications that I put in, everybody in there is a felon, so it just don't even bother. They're not going to be calling around looking, because we're all felons. Okay, it's maybe not murder or something like that, but we've all had maybe a DUI or something like that. I think DUI is a felony now, isn't it? So there, if you got a DUI, you got to put, "Oh yeah, I'm a convicted felon." And this guy's, going on and on about, "Oh, I can't do that. I'll drink if I put," I'm like, well, okay, you get through it in your own way, and I get. But anyway, back to this mere code. If a mere code of morals or better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. This isn't about a mere code of morals or a better. This is about a complete surrender of your life to God. And the way I perceive it and the way I experience it is, my only reason for living from that day on, that I flipped that switch in my head, was to serve God. And it's not one of those things that I can reverse. It's like when you go from that story of going from the cucumber to the pickle. You can never become a pickle again, because you've been transformed. And to me, that's the same thing that we're talking about, that the mere code of morals or better philosophy of life is one of the things that many people are working hard at in recovery, and it eludes them, the idea that your reason for living is to serve God, and it's almost like a switch in your head that must be flipped. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral. We could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. And I guess I could tell you that's how I came to that conclusion. That I may have tried that mere code of morals. I don't remember much of that, but it was like a long time ago for me. It's been almost 20 plus years. So, but I do remember that I didn't have the complete concept of a complete surrender of my life to God. So lack of power, and this is something that many people refer to, this paragraph here, and it's a good one. It's just a pretty good explanation of what we're doing here. Lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had to find a power with which we could live. And you notice that he's not talking about a whole lot of God here. He's talking about power, this whole power greater than yourself thing. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how were we to find this power? Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object, this book's main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. And what is our problem? Our problem is that we get a week or two of sobriety, and out of nowhere comes that thought in my head that I can have one drink. And that's the insanity that we speak of in step 2. The subtle insanity that precedes the first drink is you can have one. when you know you can't have one. You've been doing this for some time, and you have well established the idea that you cannot have one without it leading to another and another. But out of nowhere, even some people would, I know guys that are doing this crap for 20 years since they know about the details of the steps, and here they are 20 years later still thinking, I can have one, and off they go, you know. But that insanity will be restored, will be taken away from us. It will be, our sanity will be restored when we get out into the inventory, the daily inventory and the application of the spiritual solutions of the latter steps, like 10, 11, and 12. That means we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral, and it means, of course, we're going to talk about God. There's that word. You know, I always hear people say something like, there is no God in the second step, but failing to notice that the very next step, step 3, says, made a decision to turn your will and your life over to the care of God. You know, I don't... I think what happens is I saw myself in... I think it's the chapter Working with Others where he says, this statement, he says, some of us had even become violently anti-religious, and that's what I was. I know that's, when looking back on it, I had become violently anti-religious, and I'll tell you why I became violently anti-religious, because I found a God of my understanding long before I ever got sober, and I looked at these people who came in here with their religion, or not in here, I was out and I was sleeping on park benches, and religious people would wake me up and hand me pamphlets and try to save my soul, and I would... And, you know, it was always the thing that I was going to hell if I didn't believe in their version of God, and that irked me, man. That rubbed me the wrong way because I felt like you're looking down on me, like you're better than I am because I don't believe in what... If I don't... I'm going to some place that I don't even believe in if I don't believe in, you know, and in my opinion, what it felt like to me was people were looking down on me, and I didn't like it. Even though I was sleeping on a bench, I didn't like people who had a home somewhere looking down on me, you know. But anyway, that's why I had become violently anti-religious. But I hear a lot of people make a reference to there is no God in the second step was what I had gotten off on there. And the God is in this chapter. I haven't counted, but it's numerous. I think I've circled like 25 times the word God is in these next few pages. Here difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man to watch his hope rise as we discuss his alcoholic problems and explain our fellowship, but his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters. And out in the chapter Working with Others is one of my favorite passages in this book, and it says that in dealing with these people, in dealing with an agnostic, that's why when like Dr. Bob would, first thing he'd say was, do you believe in God? Because we got to know whether you believe in God or not if I'm trying to explain the 12 steps to you. And I'm sure they did come across people who either said, no, I don't believe in God, or shit, you know, I don't know. Do I believe in God? I haven't really answered that question yet. So once the sponsor who's trying to help another person establishes who they're dealing with, where they're sitting in the God thing, then you can establish how to approach them. And what it says out in the chapter Working with Others is, in dealing with these atheists and agnostics, you'd better use everyday terms to describe spiritual principles. And what he's essentially saying is that, like, my sponsor is a real religious guy, and sometimes it rubbed me the wrong way, but he was so smart and he helped so many people, I tended to overlook it, like, you know, one of his shortcomings or something, you know. But I think the world of the guy, but he was like really, he called the Bible the bigger book. You guys are reading the big book, need to get into that bigger book. But so the real world's principles, the real world terms that they're speaking of, when you're dealing with an atheist and an agnostic and you're trying to help somebody understand the whole, you know, you got to turn your life over to God thing, is what he used to say, and this is the way a lot of it really is worded, if you'll put it this way, is when you do good things, you're going to feel good about who you are. And that's a real world term in describing how getting close to God. When I do things for God, I'm going to feel this sixth sense, this vital sixth sense. I'm going to feel the presence of a loving Creator in my life through what I do. By helping others and thinking of others and doing for others, I will essentially develop this vital sixth sense. The feeling of the presence and consciousness, this God consciousness that they speak of, comes from what you do. And those are the real world terms of describing, you know, not like we're going to sit in a circle and hold hands and pray for Aunt What's-Her-Name to come talk to us in some kind of seance or something. How close you get to God, it manifests in what you do with your life every day. If you do good, you're going to feel good about who you are, and if you do bad, you're going to feel bad about who you are. What does an alcoholic do who feels bad about who he is? Alcohol feels good. We don't really have a decision whether we want to take a drink because it's an inside job type thing. Where was we? But his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God, for we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. I don't know who, but I didn't have a wife and kids and family and career and job and all that, so I got the whole answer the God question out of the way early. But I have noticed that a couple of the guys that I have worked with over the years who have actually said to me, I don't know, I haven't really contemplated the question of is there a God, yes or no. It's just not one of those things I was doing. I was sidetracked with my career and my wife and kids, and I hadn't gotten to that question, whereas my personal experience, I had spent a couple of years that I had to answer that question, and I was doing a whole lot of smoking and drinking and whatnot. But anyway, these people who haven't answered that question, it seemed to me that they had simply not gotten to it because there were other pressing matters in their life, and they just put the God thing on a shelf somewhere and said, well, we'll get back to that later. The wife and kids need me. The company needs me. Whatever it was that what they were doing at that time. So we had reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. We know how he feels. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. Some of us have been violently anti-religious. Now, there it is. I thought it was out in that other chapter. So that was me. Some of us had been violently anti-religious. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea of him which someone had tried to impress upon them during childhood, which is the religious thing that they associate. Many people do, and I see it in a lot of the anti-God news channels. Like you probably know which ones they are. There's news channels out there that the only time they ever use the word God is to put people who believe in God down, and that word God is not associated. It takes them straight to religion. They can't separate the word God from religion. To them, it's one and the same. And anyway, to others, the word God brought up a particular idea of him with which someone had tried to impress them during childhood. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. When we were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power greater than ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. We looked upon this world of warring individuals, warring theological systems and inexplicable calamity. That's one of the biggest ideas that I hear a lot in the society today, that all wars were created by religion, that the idea of the Jews and the Christians and all the wars then going back to like the Crusades, the Christian Crusades, and back in the old days, and that all these wars were based on two religions battling it out. So we looked upon this world of warring individuals, warring theological systems, and that theological systems is the religious concepts. Theology is like discussion of God or something. An inexplicable calamity with deep skepticism, we looked askance at many individuals who claimed to be godly. How could a supreme being have anything to do with it all? And who could comprehend a supreme being anyhow? Yet, in other moments, we found ourselves thinking, when enchanted by a starlit night, who then made all this? There was a feeling of awe and wonder, but it was fleeting and soon lost. Yes, we of agnostic temperament. Don't forget that Bill Wilson wrote this book, and he's not ghostwriting this chapter as, when you go out and you read the chapter to wives was written by Bill. And when you read it, it says, we wives approached our husbands in this way. But Bill's not a wife. He didn't approach his husband. He sought input from the wives that he had known of the people that was around him at the time. So you could almost say that Bill Wilson ghost wrote the chapter to wives because he wasn't a wife. He was the guy that was drinking. He was the husband. But he got the input from the wives. So he was like the ghost writer of that chapter. But however, when you read this, Bill Wilson was an agnostic. He was not sure. Why is it when you go back to Bill Wilson's story, he says, my friend had emphasized that hang on. I'll read it. You guys, we'll go back to Bill's story just for a sec, so you don't think that this is page 12 back in Bill's story. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. So this is a paragraph that explains that the guy who wrote this book, the guy who made somewhat, you could say, the founder, we call him the co-founder, but he was really AA number one, if you'd put it that way. And if it wasn't for him, there wouldn't have been no Dr. Bob co-founder. So this is what he says. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? So if this guy doesn't believe, if this guy believes in God, why is this something that bothers him? That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. So this is flat out proof positive that Bill Wilson was an agnostic. So this is not a ghost-written chapter. This is a chapter written as an agnostic who knows something about it. Okay. If he had written a chapter that said we atheists, he might not have been able, because I think he says I had always believed in a power greater than myself. I mean, I'd go back to that one too, but it's going to take too long. Yes, we of agnostic temperament. Is that where I left off? Yeah. Yes, we of agnostic temperament have had these thoughts and experiences. Let us make haste to reassure you. We found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results. Even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power which is God. So that is a statement written by an agnostic who was Bill W., our founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Much to our relief, we discovered that we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach, and to make the approach to God, obviously, and to effect a contact with Him. Now, don't forget, this contact with God, I come to some of these meditation meetings, and I don't mean to throw people under the bus or talk bad about them, but it seems to me that some people are just completely, it eludes them how to make contact with God. And I had somebody else explain it to me. I have to admit it was kind of a mysterious thing to me too. There was a time when I thought praying and meditating and making a conscious contact with God was similar to sitting in a seance where everybody's holding hands waiting for Aunt Aunt Griselda to come down and tell us where the money's buried or something, which some people, even what was it, Hillary Clinton even had some seance to talk to her grandmother or something. So there's a lot of people out there who believe in stuff like that, and that's what I thought. This whole idea, they turn out the lights, they play some kind of whale songs, they sit for like 20 minutes and they count down to some kind of meditation. And my only thought is, how long do you have to meditate? The answer is given to you. And step 11 is the question. Step 12 is the answer. So what does he say here? He says, we commenced to get results even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power which is God. We found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in that power, we commenced to get results. Where was I here? Oh, here it was. Was sufficient. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and to effect a contact with Him. And the contact that we're trying to get to here is not that seance thing where everybody sits around, turns the lights out, and wail. The contact is that we begin to understand that when I do good things and I treat other people in a loving, caring way, for the lack of a better description. I'm not very fond of that description either, but it's like the best one I can come up with, being a pig-headed guy or something, But whenever I think of other people and the well-being and the well-being of the people around me, that is how I get close to God. It's not by turning the lights out and waiting for whales to sing a certain song or counting down to some kind of deep meditational state. It's a matter of, see, that thought that you're going to make this conscious contact with God is essentially rooted in what you do with your life every day, not with how long you sit in a dark room waiting for God's presence to enter you, okay? So, as soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence or a spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed with a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. We found that God does not make too hard terms with those who seek him. To us, the realm of spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding. To those who earnestly seek, it is open, we believe, to all men. All right, we're going to stop right there. Next week, we'll pick up on the next page, and we're going to open up the floor for each one of you guys gets about 5 minutes to ramble on about what we're reading there. And remember, basically what we're getting to here is this chapter is written for the people who either don't know whether there is a God or say that no, they don't believe that there is, atheists and agnostics. So it's not like you can skip over this chapter. There's a lot of other good stuff in there, but that was the primary reason for writing that chapter, was to help the people in Butte, Montana in 1940 when the book was first released, and your sponsor was the book. Anyway, and that's not a reference to you don't need to get a sponsor. You need to get somebody who can explain the book to you, because when I came in, even today I have to read stuff repeatedly to let it sink into my head. I read sometimes 4, 5, 6, 8 times the same stuff and comes of age or language of the heart before it actually sinks in, and I start to remember it as a way of explaining recovery to other people. But okay, so we got 20 minutes. That's about 5 minutes apiece, 4 minutes apiece. You first. We'll work our way around. Thomas.
You were talking about how I remember when I was confirmed. I was born and raised Catholic. I was at my confirmation, believer, and I fought believing in God. And then all of a sudden, I'd be a reborn Christian, and then I'd have my doubts again. So I was a mess. And what I'm trying to think is, what I'm wondering is how I could have just, how did I cross that line, or and done something with my. I really didn't do anything in my life. I worked for my dad and truck driver, but I really didn't do anything in my life. Didn't go to school. Sober now. Well, when you said that, it just struck a nerve. Why couldn't I have done this and have a wife and me too and all that stuff? So you can think about that, because I always thought about that. Disbelieving, believing. He's number one right now. I don't know. I really don't have anything to say. I gotta take a leave. I'm gonna pass.
Art. Now, remember the chapter We Agnostics is written from the standpoint of someone who was an agnostic, not like the chapter to Wives where Bill Wilson sort of ghost writes as a wife. He got input from wives, but he It was written by Bill, and it appears to be written by the wives of alcoholics when you're reading it. And the chapter 2 employers, and they're seemingly ghost-written, whereas when we look back at Bill's story, Bill said that Ebby's statement that he could choose his own conception of God, it hit him hard, and it melted the icy intellectual mountain in which he had stood and shivered for years, and he had stood in the sunlight at last. It was a clear statement that Bill Wilson wasn't sure whether there was a God or not. He still had not answered that question. So when he wrote this chapter, We Agnostics, he wrote it as an agnostic, not to people who are agnostics. But one of the things that we do point out in this chapter is that from the Oxford groups, we got the idea that we don't teach religion. Remember, the Oxford groups were a very religious group. What do they call it? Back to early Christianity is what they were teaching, but they didn't place that idea into the heads of the people that they had tried to help. Their deal was to help anybody. It didn't matter what they believed in. So that's one of the things we take from that Oxford groups that's really helpful to us, is that we don't teach religion because we're the ones who are handicapped by it. It limits how many people you can help. And that was the idea that the Oxford groups had had, that if they're just going to help the Christians, then that cuts off literally 1/3 or almost half of the people that they come in contact with, who are either atheists or agnostics or of another religion that they didn't. Only thing we teach is that whatever God it is that you believe in, we're going to show you how to get in touch with that God as we know it to be, that we believe that God wants us to do things for others. So we're at the top of page 47, and he writes, When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies too to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to effect our first conscious relation with God as we understood Him. Afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which then seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth. But if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So we used our own conception, however limited it was. We needed to ask ourselves but one short question. Do I now believe, like the agnostic might say, or am I even willing to believe, that an atheist might say, that there is a power greater than myself? As soon as a man can say that he does believe or is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. Now, the way I understand it and the way I've experienced it, that's one of the things I've learned over the years, is the best way that I can try to teach somebody else how to, what did he say, to effect our first conscious relation with God. The feeling that, because that's one of the things that we're said to get from these 12 steps is the feeling of the presence of a loving Creator in our lives, the consciousness of God's presence and the power of God. And then that's one of the things that the 12th step does. You remember, whenever we're working through any one of these steps, and we're working around step 2 right now, the whole do you believe in God idea. Because when I read some of the literature of the early AA, the amount of work put into the second step really amounted to the question, do you believe in God? The first step amounted to, do you want to stop drinking? They would say, yeah. And the second step was, do you believe in God? And hopefully they said, yeah. And okay, let's start making a list of the things that are blocking you from God. I don't see any details. And the reason I say that is because I had 2 guys that had a lot of time. The first guy had like 20 years. The second guy had like 41 years, who actually formally took me through the steps. And I've been through the steps dozens of times in other formats, meetings, and anyway. But the idea that we're going to gain this conscious contact with God first has to start with the idea that you are not God in step 1, and that there is a God in step 2. And out in the chapter We Agnostics, Bill writes that in dealing with these people, these atheists or agnostics, and in the future, as the 12th step puts it, my job is to be where I can be of the most assistance, stay on the firing line and God won't let you down. And where you can be the most help is these people who don't believe in God or don't know that there is a God. So one of the things that we're learning from this chapter is how to deal with people who, in the future, either if that's this problem that you are having now, or if it's a problem that you run into somebody who has this problem, and you say, you know, okay, I got a sponsee now who says he doesn't know if he believes in God. How are you going to deal with this person? So this is one of the reasons this chapter was written. And the reason I say that is because when I first got sober, I wasn't aware of it, but I had heard people make mention to this chapter as somewhere in this chapter was a reference to you could get sober without God. But that's not what it says. It says, as soon as men can say he does believe or is willing to believe. And that was probably the latter half of that, because you got this first guy down packed. This atheist, this agnostic guy says that he does believe now, or the atheist guy may be saying that he is willing to believe that there may be something out there. We emphatically assure him that he is on his way. And at that point, you go on with the rest of the steps. And as this person that you're dealing with goes through the steps, they will get what it is that's outlined. You will lose interest in selfish things and feel the presence of a loving Creator in your life as you live a life of service for others. Anyway, that was the great news to us, for we had assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith, which seemed difficult to believe. When people presented us with spiritual approaches, how frequently did we all say, I wish I had what that man has. I'm sure it would work if I could only believe as he believes. But I cannot accept as surely true the many articles of faith which are so plain to him. So it was comforting to learn that we could commence at a simpler level. Besides a seeming inability to accept much on faith, we often found ourselves handicapped by obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. Many of us have been so touchy that even casual reference to spiritual things made us bristle with antagonism. This sort of thinking had to be abandoned. And, you know, for myself, I have to say that I actually did experience those feelings when I was, before I had gotten sober, the sensitiveness and unreasoning prejudice. I always felt like I was being spoken down to by religious people. And that's where I made the connection, was the whole God thing. And I didn't separate God from the religion that I had experienced. I do today. I see them as two entirely different things. I see faith in God and believing in God as two entirely, completely different things. Do I believe in God is a simple yes, I believe in God. And faith in God is something that I feel inside, a feeling of peace and content that everything's going to be okay is the best way that I could describe it. And they are two completely different things. But early on, I had to burn the idea into my head that they weren't the same, that religion and God are two different things, because religion's just, you know, some people's point of view, and that's the way I had to look at it. But that's where this antagonism came up, and the prejudice, unreasoning prejudice, the obstinacy, the sensitiveness. Many of us have been so touchy that even casual reference to spiritual things made us bristle with antagonism. This sort of thinking had to be abandoned. Though some of us resisted, we found no great difficulty in casting aside such feelings. Faced with alcoholic destruction, and that's what made me change my mind. I don't know about you guys, but I didn't come in here not believing in God, but I did come in here not having faith or trusting in God. I thought it was sort of a you're on your own thing, you know. But it was this idea that faced with alcoholic destruction that, in my opinion, turned my life around and turned the lives of so many people around me around. That it took me all the way to the end of my alcoholism before I actually became willing to say, okay, what's the God thing? Let me hear it. We'll give it a shot before I'm out of here. But faced with alcoholic destruction, we soon became as open-minded on spiritual matters as we had tried to be on other questions. In this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be as prejudiced for as long as some of us. And I don't know about you guys, but I think this may be one of the ideas here that, see, I happen to be working with some people who have been struggling for more than decades, maybe even a decade and a half to 2 decades of being in AA and going in and out. And it just, for some reason, those people end up with sponsors who are said to, have a little more time, a little more knowledge, because, they just work their way through the other sponsors. Those guys couldn't help me, maybe you can. So I end up with, I would have to say, at least 7 or 8 people who are what I call the worst case scenarios. And this is what I think that they're struggling with, is this prejudice that it finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be prejudiced for as long as some of us were. That for as long as some of us were is a reference to these almost decades that some of these people are going through. And anyway, it's one of the things that I struggle with is why did I get it after 5 years of what I call absolute hell? But I know these people that I have going through literally decades, 2 decades of nightmare, of just homelessness and jail and drunk. And the reader may still ask why he should believe in a power greater than himself. We think that there are good reasons. Let us have a look at some of them. The practical individual of today is a stickler for facts and results. Nevertheless, the 20th century readily accepts theories of all kinds, provided they are firmly grounded in fact. We have numerous theories, for example, about electricity. Everybody believes them without a murmur of a doubt. Why this ready acceptance? Simply because it's impossible to explain what we see, feel, direct, and use without a reasonable assumption as a starting point. Everybody nowadays believes in scores of assumptions for which there is good evidence but no perfect visual proof. And does not science demonstrate that visual proof is the weakest proof? It is being constantly revealed as mankind studies the material world that outward appearances are not inward reality at all. To illustrate, the prosaic steel girder is a mass of electrons whirling around each other at an incredible speed. These tiny bodies are governed by precise laws, and these laws hold true throughout the material world. Science tells us so. We have no reason to doubt it. When, however, the perfectly logical assumption is suggested that underneath the material world and life as we see it, there is an all-powerful, guiding, creative intelligence right there, our perverse streak comes to the surface, and we laboriously set out to convince ourselves that it isn't so. We read wordy books and indulge in windy arguments, thinking we believe this universe needs no God to explain it. Where our contentions were true, it would follow that life originated out of nothing, means nothing, and proceeds nowhere. Instead of regarding ourselves as intelligent agents, spearheads of God's advancing creation, we agnostics and atheists choose to believe that our human intelligence was the last word, the alpha and the omega, the beginning and end of it all. Rather vain of us, wasn't it? Now, when you read some of the other literature, primarily I'm talking about the back of Comes of Age, there's psychiatry, religion, medicine looks at AA, religion looks at AA is in the back of that book, and there's some real good stuff in there about what psychiatrists see, because you know that the psychiatrists have been studying alcoholics all along, the whole time we've been in AA and before AA. And, back to the beginning of, I guess, where psychiatry started, they've been sitting us down somewhere and trying to crack open our heads and say, why do these people do what they're doing? What is it? How come we can't help them? How come? And they're trying to figure out how they can help us and what's wrong with us all along. You know that, right? So in some of the literature in there is very detailed explanations by psychiatrists as to why alcoholics drink. And some of the things that all alcoholics have in common are noted in there. And one of the things that is noted as something that all alcoholics have in common is an omnipotent feeling of almost a godlike ego that these alcoholics have. And what they were noticing has happened to these alcoholics as they get them was they would be smashed by alcohol and their ego would be just completely broken down to nothing, virtually just non-existent anymore, to the point that they might lay down and die if it wasn't for the fact that the ego restores itself. And that was one of the most common things that they had found. And one of the things that I've noticed is that what the psychiatrists say is that they would do nothing to keep this ego from restoring itself back to this as spearhead of God's ever-advancing creation. We agnostics and atheists choose to believe that our human intelligence was the last word, the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end of all. Rather vain of us, wasn't it? And that is in a sense, and when you read on in the big book here, we'll see that selfishness and self-centeredness is the root cause of alcoholism, driven by fear. And the way I've experienced that fear was this lingering fear in the back of my head that I might not be in charge of everything. Because that, although I know today that it was a childish, uneducated way of looking at the world that I was in, I didn't know that then. And as someone who's found his way out of it, I can look back in hindsight and say that may very well be some of the trouble that people that are coming in behind us are experiencing. You know, people who are just now starting to drink right now may be coming into AA 10 years from now, and they're going to be going through the exact same thing that I went through. Am I the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end of all, instead of seeing myself as the spearhead of God's creation? And that's pretty much what it amounts to today. But the deflation of the ego, and then, you see, because that's what the deflation of the ego for me says, well, I guess you're not in charge of anything. So maybe there is something else out there that is in charge. And that's the reference that he's making here, is that you have to smash the idea that you're in charge of anything in step one with alcohol, and then give in to the idea that there may be something else running this place. And we who have traveled this dubious path beg you to lay aside prejudice even against organized religion. We have learned that whatever the human frailties of various faiths may be, those faiths have given purpose and direction to millions. People of faith have a logical idea of what life is all about. Actually, we used to have no reasonable conception whatever. We used to amuse ourselves by cynically dissecting spiritual beliefs and practices when we might have observed that many spiritually minded persons of all races, colors, and creeds were demonstrating a degree of stability, happiness, and usefulness which we should have sought ourselves. Instead, we looked at the human defects of those people and sometimes used their shortcomings as a basis of wholesale condemnation. We talked of intolerance while we were intolerant ourselves. We missed the reality and the beauty of the forest because we were diverted by the ugliness of some of its trees. We never gave the spiritual side of life a fair hearing. In our personal stories, you will find a wide variation in the way each teller approaches and conceives of the power which is greater than himself. And you know, I have many people, although I haven't gone back there and read all those stories, I have heard many people make reference to the fact that when you go back into those personal stories in the back, to me, when I read them, I see like drunk-a-log. I heard somebody say, just go to the last 2 pages of every story and read those last 2 pages, and that'll probably benefit you better than the drunk-a-log of the first 8 pages of each story, you know. But I highly recommend reading those. I've only read like maybe 6 or 8 of them, but I know for a fact there's a lot more back there than that. I usually read like Bill or Dr. Bob's Nightmare and Bill Dobson's story and the AA number, the Devil May Care chap. Okay, whether we agree with a particular approach or conception seems to make little difference. Experience has taught us that these are matters about which, for our purpose, we need not be worried. They are questions for each individual to settle for himself. But there is one idea that we have, and that is a life of service to others. In Bill's story, he wrote, if he failed to enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. And that's how we perceive Step 12. Step 12 in itself is a life of work and self-sacrifice. And when someone asks you to sponsor them, you have to sacrifice your time and say, well, you know, I was going fishing Saturday, and I had this other thing planned, and I was going to sleep late and then go see a movie or eat something. You have to say no. You have to put all that aside, and it's time for you to live a life of work and self-sacrifice for others. And we believe that this is God. That is one idea that we do believe applies to everybody. That's how Alcoholics Anonymous works, by the way. On one proposition, however, these men and women strikingly agreed. Every one of them has gained access to and believes in a power greater than himself. This power has in each case accomplished a miraculous, the humanely... Now remember, he's referring to the personal stories in the back there. He just brought up there. This power has in each case accomplished the miraculous, the humanely impossible, As a celebrated American statesman put it, let's look at the record. And I got a friend who loves to say that. Hey, look at the record, you know. But anyway, drying out. Now he writes here are thousands, but when you read the book, he says we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women. So when he says we are thousands of men and women, he may be referring to the families of all these people. Because for every one drunk, there was the wife, the kids, the parents. And so when he said thousands, that may be what he's talking about. Here are thousands of men and women, worldly indeed. They flatly declare that since they have come to believe in a power greater than themselves, to take a certain attitude toward that power, and to do certain simple things, there has been a revolutionary change in their way of living and thinking. In the face of collapse and despair, in the face of the total failure of their human resources, they found that a new power, peace, happiness, and sense of direction flowed into them. This happened soon after they wholeheartedly met a few simple requirements. Once confused and baffled by the seemingly futility of existence, they show the underlying reasons why they were making heavy going of life. Leaving aside the drink question, they tell why living was so unsatisfactory. They show how the change came over them when many hundreds of people are able to say that the consciousness of the presence of God is today the most important fact of their lives. They present a powerful reason why one should have faith. You know, when we're reading this chapter, remember that in the beginning of the chapter, he says we agnostics and atheists are roughly 50% of the original fellowship, that half of the people who got sober are of this atheist or agnostic category. And when we're reading this chapter, what we're reading is that they are now believers. You're not reading that they got sober and they're still atheists. You're not reading that they got sober and they're still agnostics. They haven't answered that question. And when we get into some of these latter paragraphs over here, we're going to see what he says. He says, one of the paragraphs I have almost memorized is, actually we were fooling ourselves. For deep down inside every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. It may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things, but this whole chapter is telling us that they became converts. I'll be done in just a minute. We'll open up the floor for open discussion. So, this world of ours has made more material progress in the last century than all the millenniums which have went before. Almost everyone knows the reason. Students of ancient history tell us that the intellect of men in those days was equal to the best of today. Yet in ancient times, material progress was painfully slow. The spirit of modern scientific inquiry, research, and invention was almost unknown. In the realm of the material, men's minds were fettered by superstition, tradition, and all sorts of fixed ideas. Some of the contemporaries of Columbus thought a round earth preposterous. Others came near putting Galileo to death for his astronomical heresies. We asked ourselves this: are not some of us just as biased and unreasonable about the realm of the spirit as were the ancients about the realm of the material? Even in the present century, American newspapers were afraid to print the account of the Wright brothers' first successful flight at Kitty Hawk. Had not all efforts at flight failed before? Did not Professor Langley's flying machine go to the bottom of the Potomac River? Was it not true that the best mathematical minds had proved man could never fly? Had not people said God had reserved the privilege for the birds? Only 30 years later, the conquest of the air was almost an old story and airplane travel was in full swing. But in most fields, our generation has witnessed complete liberation of our thinking. Show any longshoreman a Sunday supplement describing a proposal to explore the moon by means of a rocket, and he will say, I bet they do it. Maybe not so long either. Is not our age characterized by the ease with which we discard old ideas for new, by the complete readiness with which we throw away the theory or gadget which does not work for something new which does? We had to ask ourselves why we shouldn't apply to our human problems the same readiness to change our point of view. We were having trouble with personal relationships. We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were prey to misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. Was not a basic solution to these bedevilments more important than whether we should see newsreels of lunar flight? Of course it was. Now, there's one good idea for you. Full of fear, we were unhappy, we couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. You know, that's almost the fundamental idea behind recovery from alcoholism, is to write down our fears, ask God to remove them, direct our attention to helping others. When we saw others solve their problems by a simple reliance upon a spirit of the universe, we had to stop doubting the power of God. Our ideas did not work, but the God idea did. The Wright brothers' almost childish, simple faith that they could build a machine which could fly was the mainspring of their accomplishment. Without that, nothing could have happened. We agnostics and atheists were sticking to the idea that self-sufficiency would solve our problems. When others showed us that the God sufficiency worked for them, we began to feel like those who had listened to the Wrights could never fly, insisted the Wrights could never fly. Logic is great stuff. We liked it. We still like it. It is not by chance that we were given the power to reason, to examine the evidence of our senses, and to draw conclusions. That is one of man's magnificent attributes. We agnostically inclined would not feel satisfied with the proposal which does not lend itself to reasonable approach and interpretation. Hence, we are at pains to tell why we think our present faith is reasonable, why we think it is more sane and logical to believe than not to believe, why we say our former thinking was soft and mushy when we threw up our hands in doubt and said, we don't know. So when we became alcoholics, crushed by a self-imposed crisis, we could not postpone or evade. We had to fearlessly face the proposition that either God is everything or else he is nothing. God either is or he isn't. What's your choice to be? We're going to stop right there. And, you know, I've got that circled as the test for the second step. When we became alcoholics, crushed by a self-imposed crisis, that it was this very idea of the first step that drives me to the second step. The first step being I finally come to the conclusion that I am not in control of my life. I can't even control my drinking. So then lies the question, if I'm not in control, then who is? Is when we became alcoholics, crushed by a self-imposed crisis, this self-imposed crisis being, you know, the loss of the job, the jail, the homelessness, all the things that happen to us alcoholics when we've been drinking for. We could not postpone or evade. We had to fearlessly face the proposition that either God is everything or else he is nothing. And this is a simple question, and it is that, do you believe in God? When I read in some of the other literature where he just, you know, it's flat out that they just say, you know, do you want to stop drinking? And that's pretty much if you say yeah. Because I have to tell you, I have run into a couple of people who said, well, you know, I'm having a little trouble. I want to burn a doob on the weekend and maybe a beer every once in a while. And I say, well, you know, I don't know what to tell you then. That was the wrong answer, you know. The answer was, yes, I want to stop drinking. But I have run into a couple of people, and I was surprised, I have to tell you. I've scratched my head, and I go, I happen to know this particular individual, and your life is pretty bad. And that was the wrong answer to that question. The answer to the question is, yes, I want to stop drinking. And the second question is, do you believe in God? And that is what that paragraph says. God either is or he isn't. What's your choice to be? God either is or isn't. Do you believe, yes or no? So remember that I was bringing up a minute ago, out in the chapter Working with Others is a particular paragraph that says when you're dealing with these people, when you come across somebody who's atheist or agnostic, you don't want to arouse any of this this violently anti-religious attitude. So you don't want to make reference to religious things. You want to stick to the spiritual things. You want to, and one of the things he points out is that we do have in Alcoholics Anonymous a way of describing spiritual principles by using everyday language. How I experience that and how I read it in the book is that, number one, selfishness and self-centeredness is the root of my troubles, and it is driven by 100 forms of fear. What I do is I make a list of these things that are blocking me from a life of service to others and a life in which I live for sacrifice for others. And it is by doing things for others and not expecting something in return that I begin to feel a sense, like I said, a God consciousness, a sense that this power greater than myself is here. And it is by doing for others that I feel the presence of God, and that's all there is to it. You don't think your way into faith in God. You have to work your way through the 12th step of helping others. Getting close to God is working with others through the 12 steps, both in my life and helping them live it into their lives. So with that, we got like 25 minutes. That's plenty of time for everybody. So as long as someone doesn't go off on a tirade like I do, rambling on, we got plenty of time. We started over here last week. We'll go with this side. Hey, Joe.
It's funny, I just got my job back in Publix, and I was working at that supermarket before that, but I was the parking lot in a Jehovah's Witness place, you know? No, I respect anyone's religion or anything they're into. So I talked to her, and she handed me like 4 books to read, you know, little magazines. And I started reading them, and the one thing it talked about was kind of like how they do here in BigBook about electricity. They talk about a cell, how complex it is, and the nucleus and the DNA and the RNA and how it works and how the walls like to shut electric energy food in and you know there's a whole system to it and just the building block of life and the whole point was how did something come from nothing? If there's no cells, no nothing. How the heck did like another good example of like a human being makes a robot. The robot didn't make itself, it was produced by an intelligent design. And it's kind of like you were saying about something about us that there had to be somebody who started this all, you know. And I'm not into that religion. I have my own religion, but I'm also spiritual too, you know. And yeah, I think I told her I'm looking for God, you know, and to be willing and humble. And when I went to rehab, there's a few times I felt like drinking last year. Anytime I did it, whether it was by my sponsor or somebody else, just thank God I did it, because I don't want to go back to that. My mom took out a home equity loan in her house for me to go to rehab. And so even if I wasn't doing it for myself, I had to do it for her. I have children, and just so many things, Another sponsor I had way back said to me, so yeah, I was thinking about drinking. You want a glass of battery life up? I said no, and it's funny, But another thing that happens to me all the time in public is I don't know where anything is in the whole store. You look up at the signs, how much stuff is. I'll notice something, or somebody will ask for something one day, and then I know where it is. I find out where it is. Later on in the day, like another person like, well, do you know where, I don't know, aluminum foil is? It's right on the floor, So it looks like I know what I'm doing, but I think just like God in a little subtle way, little hint, Kind of thing, so I'm sure.
My name's Arthur. I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, Art.
Across my way here, I had that experience of getting out of myself, like a switch. When you get locked in a room and you got to live in there 23 hours out of the day, I'm talking about jail, when you're used to going pretty much anywhere and doing anything you wanted the day before. I had that experience, that desperation to talk about of slowing down. That's what it was all about. My life
Hey, Tom.
Power from God changed my life. It says right here on page 52 that what was it? We followed. When we saw others solve their problems by simple reliance on the spirit of the universe, the power of the universe, we had to stop doubting the power of God. Our idea did not work, but the God idea did. And when I made the decision to even believe in God, something happened. And something did happen. I like what it said over here on 53. It's logic is great stuff. We like it. We still like it. It's not by chance we were given the strength to reason, or the power to reason, to examine the evidence of our senses, and to draw conclusions. But when I was out there, I didn't reason my senses or anything. I just did. I went to drink. And that's all I wanted to do. If I even found strength to go to work, I could make money from drink. I just live to drink. Now I believe in this power of the universe, which is God. The thing we're working on is clearing away the stuff that blocks me from Him, so I can do what I should have been doing the whole time. I should have been serving others, and that's what God wants me to do. When I'm full of I'm being selfish and dishonest, angry, and afraid, I'm being blocked from God. And I can't do anything for Him. I'm not good for anybody else. I'm not good for myself.
Can you hear me now?
Since I was sober, it's great. The last 21 years, I had some bad days. Like Rob was saying, and, it's nothing like when I was out there drinking. I like my life. I got a wife who loves me, actually, and I love her. We have some ups and downs, and sometimes I'm doubtful. Everything seems to be going pretty good in all areas of my life. Good, I'm done. I got what I wanted to do.
Mike, I have Michael, I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, Mike.
It's really amazing to me because I love to hear you guys. 3 weeks ago, my night was the white light. So you came on and life's been so good. I went from 4 days on the street to going back to my trade, getting a job, a sponsor, and just being happy. And good things are coming. I have not asking for them. I'm not in my higher power. I believe in my higher power. I had 13 years over one time. I took my problem back. And I went on a 6-year run. When things were good for 4 years, and 2 years, boom, all the way down. And I feel like I'm going to glow in the dark when I walk outside. The happiness just surrounding me. And I love that you say like 2.5 years, nothing really bad. The last few weeks have been so amazing, and everybody we meet has helped me get to the point in 3 weeks. It's not all going to be like this forever. I'm praying it does. In my higher power, my God, I feel like it's here. I get something from everything out there. Doesn't matter where I go or what alcohol is in the room. I love it. I just pray with my higher power. Best thing I've heard is just lean on the ground. Whatever we need to come up with. That's what I've been doing. I believe it's good.
Okay, can we have a volunteer to hand out the chips?
Oh, yeah, when I talk alcoholic,
Hey, Tom.
we got chips this one here. First chip, the center chip. Would anyone like to give up the fight? No way.
Side.
Next one is silver chip for 30 days. All right, cool. Yellow is 60 days. Red is 3 months. Purple is 9 months. And hey, I got 21 years this month. Put your name back here if you got a year this month, and we will celebrate it with cake and stuff. Funny rides and all that stuff.
The promises of the ninth step.
The promises of the ninth step. If we are painstaking about the stage of our development, we will be amazed before we are halfway through. We are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. We will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. We will comprehend the word serenity and we will know peace. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experiences can benefit others. The feeling of usefulness and self-pity will disappear. We will lose interest in our self-esteem and gain interest in our fellows. Self-seeking will slip away. The whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Fear of people and economic insecurity will leave us. We will intuitively know how to handle situations with each compassion. We will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. Are these extravagant promises? No. They are being fulfilled among us sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. They will always materialize as we work for them.
And anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all of our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. We'll close with the Lord's Prayer.
Let's have a moment of silence. Our Father,
Lord in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
hey, thanks for that.
Hey, when you get your man.
And all right. Can I get a signature on this side?
The old Herbie Hancock?
Yeah,
Where at?
this one here.
Right there?
Of course, I'm making my own sheets.
Right there?
Yeah, that's good.
I didn't want to get a big one.
Thanks, Doug.
All right, man.